The wind howled across the Wyoming plains like a wounded animal, carrying sheets of cold rain that blurred the horizon into a gray wall. Most men with any sense would have found shelter hours ago, but Ethan Carter had spent half his life working under open skies. A little rain wasn't enough to stop him. At 45 years old, Ethan had become the kind of man people rarely noticed. He wasn't rich. He wasn't famous. He didn't own a ranch or a town business. He moved from one cattle job to the next, earning enough to survive and keeping mostly to himself. The truth was, loneliness had become as familiar to him as the saddle beneath him. His horse, Duke, trudged steadily through the mud as thunder rolled overhead. Ethan pulled his hat lower and scanned the distant landscape. That was when he saw it. A small ranch sitting alone against the storm. Even from a distance something looked wrong. The fence line was broken in several places. A gate hung loose on one hinge. Several cattle were wandering far beyond the property line. And near the barn, two figures were desperately trying to round them up. Ethan slowed his horse. One of the figures was a woman. The other looked like a young girl. They were struggling against the wind, shouting commands that disappeared into the storm before reaching the cattle. Ethan sighed. He had planned to reach Riverton before nightfall and spend a few days enjoying hot meals and a soft bed. Instead, he turned Duke toward the ranch. Some problems were impossible to ignore. As he rode closer, he could hear the woman yelling, "Lily, move around the other side." "I'm trying." The girl slipped in the mud and nearly fell. A frightened cow charged past her. Without hesitation, Ethan spurred Duke forward. "Cut left," he shouted. The woman turned sharply. Her eyes widened at the sight of a stranger galloping toward them through the rain. Ethan swung his rope. The loop landed perfectly around the runaway cow's neck. Within seconds, he redirected the animal back toward the herd. The woman stared. The girl looked even more shocked. For the next hour, nobody spoke much. There wasn't time. Together, they pushed the scattered cattle back inside the property. The storm fought them every step of the way. Mud coated their boots. Rain soaked their clothes. By the time the final animal was secured, all three were exhausted. The woman leaned against the fence post, breathing hard. "Thank you," she finally said. Her voice was strong despite her exhaustion. Ethan removed his hat politely. "You looked like you could use another pair of hands." The woman studied him carefully. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with appearance. There was determination in her eyes. Strength. The kind that only came from surviving difficult years. "My name is Grace Holloway," she said. "This is my daughter Lily." The girl offered a small smile. "Ethan Carter." Grace looked toward the broken fence. "We would have lost half the herd tonight without your help." "You still might," Ethan replied honestly. Grace followed his gaze. Several sections of fencing were hanging by little more than hope. The barn roof looked damaged. One side of the corral had nearly collapsed. The ranch seemed to be falling apart piece by piece. "How long has it been like this?" Ethan asked. Grace hesitated. "A while." That answer told him everything. People didn't let their ranches reach this condition unless they had no other choice. Thunder cracked overhead. "Come inside," Grace said. "You're soaked." The farmhouse was small and worn. Years of hardship showed in every corner. The furniture was old. The floorboards creaked. The kitchen table had been repaired so many times it barely resembled its original form. Yet despite everything, the place felt warm. Lived in. Lily prepared coffee while Grace lit additional lamps. For a few minutes they sat in silence, listening to rain hammer against the windows. Then Ethan noticed a photograph hanging above the fireplace. A man stood beside Grace and Lily. He was smiling proudly. "Your husband?" Ethan asked. Grace's expression softened. "Yes." Ethan nodded respectfully. "Where is he?" The room grew quiet. Lily stared down at her coffee. Grace took a slow breath. "Gone." The single word carried enough pain to explain everything. "How long?" 14 months. Ethan lowered his eyes. "I'm sorry." Grace offered a small nod. "He got sick. Fever took him fast." Lily swallowed hard. "He was the best man I ever knew." Nobody spoke for several moments. Outside, the storm continued raging. Finally, Ethan asked the question he already knew the answer to. "How bad is it?" Grace gave a tired laugh. "You mean the ranch?" He nodded. She stared into her coffee cup. "The bank says we have 3 months." Ethan frowned. 3 months until what? Until they take everything. The words landed heavily. Lily looked away. Grace continued. After my husband died, I tried to keep things running. We sold livestock. We borrowed money. We delayed payments. But every problem created two more. She gestured toward the window. Fence repairs. Feed costs. Equipment. Taxes. Everything keeps breaking. And every time I think we're catching up, something else happens. Ethan understood. The frontier had destroyed stronger operations than this one. A widow and her teenage daughter were fighting impossible odds. Have neighbors helped? He asked. Grace laughed bitterly. Most of them think we should sell. And the rest? They're waiting to buy the land after the bank takes it. The answer irritated Ethan more than he expected. Lily suddenly spoke. They all said we'd fail. The girl's voice carried anger beyond her years. They said women can't run a ranch. They said mom should leave. Grace reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. But Ethan noticed something. Neither of them had quit. Despite everything. Despite the debt. Despite the storm. Despite the loneliness. They were still fighting. And somehow that impressed him more than any successful rancher he'd ever met. The next morning the storm finally passed. Sunlight spread across the plains. Ethan saddled Duke. Grace walked him to the yard. I appreciate what you did yesterday, she said. You don't owe us anything. Ethan looked around the ranch. The damage seemed even worse in daylight. Broken fences. Leaking roofs. Sagging structures. A dying ranch trying desperately to stay alive. How much lumber do you have? He asked. Grace blinked. What? Lumber. For repairs. Not much. How many cattle escaped? About 12. How many acres? 72. Grace narrowed her eyes. Why? Ethan glanced toward the barn. Because if nobody fixes this place soon, you won't have 3 months. You'll have 3 weeks. Grace crossed her arms. We can handle it. The words sounded strong. But Ethan heard the exhaustion behind them. The same exhaustion he'd heard in countless ranch hands who were one disaster away from losing everything. No, Ethan said gently. You can't. Grace looked offended. Before she could respond, Ethan continued. And that's not because you're weak. It's because there are only 2 of you. Silence filled the yard. For a moment nobody moved. Then Ethan surprised even himself. I'll stay for a while. Grace stared at him. What? I've got some money saved. No urgent job waiting. And this ranch needs help. Why would you do that? There it was. The same question. The same disbelief. The same suspicion he'd seen in people his entire life. Ethan shrugged. Because somebody should. Grace looked away. Almost as if accepting help felt harder than surviving alone. For the next several days, Ethan worked from sunrise until darkness. He repaired fences. Reinforced gates. Fixed sections of the barn roof. Recovered lost cattle. Repaired water lines. Every morning he woke sore. Every night he collapsed into bed exhausted. Yet something strange happened. For the first time in years he didn't feel alone. Lily followed him everywhere, asking questions about ranching. Grace worked beside him whenever possible. Slowly, laughter returned to the property. Hope returned too. One evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the hills, Ethan sat on the porch with Grace. The sky burned orange and gold. For a while neither spoke. Then Grace finally asked the question she had been holding back for days. Why are you really here, Ethan? He looked at her. What do you mean? You could be anywhere. You don't know us. You owe us nothing. Ethan stared toward the distant fields. I spent most of my life chasing work. Different ranches. Different towns. Different faces. He smiled faintly. And after a while, you realize money isn't enough reason to keep writing. Grace listened carefully. So why stay? Ethan looked directly into her eyes. Because this place deserves a chance. And because you haven't given up on it. For a moment, neither looked away. Something unspoken passed between them. A connection neither fully understood. Then footsteps interrupted them. Lily appeared in the doorway. Her expression was unusually serious. Mr. Carter? Ethan stood. What is it? The girl looked toward the dark fields. Then back at him. Her voice was barely above a whisper. If you leave now. She swallowed hard. We might lose everything. The words Lily spoke that evening stayed with Ethan long after the sun disappeared beyond the hills. If you leave now, we might lose everything. She hadn't said it to make him feel guilty. She had simply told the truth. That was what troubled him most. For nearly a week, Ethan lay awake at night staring at the ceiling of the small guest room Grace had given him. He knew staying would complicate everything. For years his life had followed a simple pattern. Or move on. Take another job. Avoid attachments. Avoid disappointment. Avoid heartbreak. But every morning when he stepped outside and saw Grace repairing fences beside him or Lily chasing cattle through the fields with determination far beyond her years, leaving became harder. The ranch wasn't just land anymore. It had become people. People he cared about. One cold morning Ethan saddled Duke. Grace watched from the porch. Neither said much. They both knew what was happening. You have to do what's right for you, Grace said softly. Ethan nodded. I know. Lily stood beside her mother. Unlike Grace, she didn't hide her disappointment. Will you come back? She asked. Ethan looked at her. I don't know. The answer hurt all three of them. Then he climbed onto his horse and rode away. For 2 weeks Ethan worked at a large cattle operation nearly 80 miles away. The pay was good. The men respected him. The work was steady. Everything should have felt normal. But it didn't. Every night his thoughts drifted back to the Holloway Ranch. He wondered whether the fences were holding. Whether Grace had enough feed. Whether Lily was still chasing runaway cattle by herself. One evening a traveling merchant stopped at camp. While sharing supper, the man mentioned a ranch near the valley. A widow's place, he said. Looks like they're struggling. Ethan froze. Grace Holloway? The merchant nodded. That's the one. What happened? Drought. Water levels dropping. Bank sent another notice. Ethan stared into the fire. The next morning, before sunrise, he packed his gear. By noon he was riding toward the Holloway Ranch. When Ethan arrived 3 days later, his heart sank. The situation was worse than he feared. The fields were dry. Several cattle looked thin. One side of the barn had partially collapsed. Grace was hauling water buckets alone. Lily was repairing fencing. Neither noticed him at first. Then Lily looked up. Her eyes widened. Mom? Grace turned. For a second she simply stared. Then a smile appeared. Not a polite smile. Not a grateful smile. A genuine one. The kind people couldn't fake. You came back, she whispered. Ethan climbed down from his horse. Looks like you still need help. Grace laughed for the first time in weeks. And somehow that sound felt like coming home. The following months became the hardest work Ethan had ever done. Together they fought for the ranch. They dug a new well. Repaired irrigation lines. Built stronger corrals. Sold livestock strategically to reduce expenses. Every dollar mattered. Every decision mattered. Some days they succeeded. Some days they barely survived. But they kept moving forward. Slowly the ranch began improving. Then disaster struck again. One night, thieves arrived. Cattle rustlers. By morning 6 valuable cows were gone. Grace was devastated. We can't keep taking losses, she said. The bank won't wait forever. Ethan clenched his jaw. That evening he rode into town. The next day he returned with something Grace never expected. A bank receipt. What is this? She asked. Ethan looked uncomfortable. I paid off the overdue interest. Grace's eyes widened. With what money? My savings. The color drained from her face. No, Ethan. It's done. You can't do that. I already did. Grace stared at him. Those were your savings. Years of work. Ethan shrugged. It was just money. Grace shook her head. No, it wasn't. Tears filled her eyes. Why would you sacrifice that for us? Ethan looked at her quietly. Then finally answered. Because somewhere along the way, this stopped being your ranch. It became ours. Silence filled the yard. Neither moved. Neither looked away. And for the first time, Grace realized what had been growing between them all along. Months passed. The drought finally broke. Spring rains arrived. Grass returned. The cattle grew healthier. The ranch slowly climbed back to life. And with every passing day, Ethan and Grace grew closer. They worked together. Ate meals together. Shared hopes and fears together. Lily noticed everything. Of course she did. One evening while Ethan repaired tack in the barn, Lily sat beside him. You love her. Ethan nearly dropped his tools. What? My mom. He laughed nervously. You're imagining things. No, I'm not. Ethan sighed. Lily crossed her arms. You look at her differently. Like Dad used to. The words hit harder than Ethan expected. For several moments neither spoke. Finally Ethan smiled. Maybe I do. Lily grinned. Took you long enough. Summer arrived. The ranch was thriving for the first time in years. Then came the county livestock auction. A huge opportunity. If they sold enough cattle at good prices, the ranch could finally become profitable again. The entire future of the Holloway Ranch depended on that day. Everyone worked tirelessly preparing. The auction arrived. The cattle performed beautifully. Buyers competed aggressively. By sunset, they had earned more money than Grace had dreamed possible. Enough to stabilize the ranch. Enough to eliminate most of the remaining debt. Enough to secure their future. That night they celebrated beneath a sky filled with stars. Lily eventually went inside, leaving Ethan and Grace alone on the porch. The same porch where countless conversations had changed both their lives. A gentle breeze moved through the valley. Neither spoke for several moments. Then Grace turned toward him. There was a time I thought this ranch would destroy me. Ethan smiled. I remember. I was terrified. You hid it well. She laughed softly. No. You just pretended not to notice. Maybe. Grace looked toward the fields then back at him. You saved us. Ethan immediately shook his head. No. You saved yourselves. I just helped. Grace stepped closer. No. You stayed. When everyone else left. You believed in us. When nobody else did. Her voice trembled. And somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you. Ethan felt his heart stop. For months he had imagined hearing those words. Now that they were real he couldn't speak. Grace smiled nervously. I probably should have said that differently. You probably should have let me say it first. She laughed through tears. Then why didn't you? Because I was scared. Ethan Carter scared? Terrified. Grace stepped even closer. So what now? Ethan reached for her hand. The same hand that had worked beside him through storms, droughts, and impossible odds. Now. He smiled. Now I tell you I've loved you for a very long time. Grace's eyes filled with tears. Then she kissed him. And everything changed. 3 months later, Ethan stood beside Grace in the small church near town. Friends and neighbors filled the wooden benches. Many were people who once doubted them. People who believed the ranch would fail. People who believed Grace couldn't survive alone. Now they watched as she proved every one of them wrong. Lily stood proudly beside her mother, barely able to stop smiling. When the preacher asked if Ethan accepted Grace as his wife, his answer came instantly. I do. When Grace was asked the same question, she laughed. I've been waiting months to say this. The church erupted with laughter. I do. And just like that, they became a family. Epilogue, 5 years later. 5 years passed. The Holloway Ranch became one of the most successful properties in the valley. The broken fences were gone. The damaged barn had been rebuilt. New cattle grazed across thriving pastures. Visitors often stopped by to admire what had been created there. But Ethan's favorite sight wasn't the ranch. It was the people. Grace still worked beside him every day. Still challenged him. Still believed in him. Lily had grown into a remarkable young woman and was preparing to manage part of the ranch herself. Sometimes, during quiet evenings, Ethan would sit on the porch and think about that storm years ago. That broken fence. Those scattered cattle. That struggling widow and her determined daughter. One decision had changed everything. A decision to stop. To help. To care. And whenever people asked how he found such a beautiful life, Ethan always gave the same answer. I wasn't looking for a family. I was just helping fix a ranch. Then he would smile toward Grace. And somehow I found a home instead.